concept referring to the natural diversity of human brains and nervous systems, which accounts for differences in perception, processing, and behavior between people. The talk you're going to hear addresses the history of neurodiversity and its growing significance for identity politics. In the second part, we discuss practical ways of making activist circles and activities more accessible and inclusive with neurodiversity in mind. Following the talk, we're going to have a Q&A. So if you have any questions that crop up during the talk, feel free to pop them in the chat so you don't forget them, and we'll make sure that Ekaterina comes back to them, or you can save them till afterwards, at which point we'll follow up. And if you don't want to speak, you can just type out your question and I'll read it out. If you would like to speak, which we definitely encourage, then pop little asterisks into the chat and we'll put you in. And if you have a direct point, I know there's people who might have experiences of what Ekaterina is talking about. So when it comes to Q&A, if you have something that you think would be useful to share or is directly relevant to what's being discussed, then pop in with 2 asterisks and we'll bump you up to the top of the list and pop you in. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Ekaterina.
Sweet, thank you. Hi, I'm Ekaterina, she, her. I'm really happy that you're joining me today for this talk on neurodiversity and activism. Many thanks to the organizers of the Building an Anti-Oppressive Climate Movement event for inviting me to deliver it. So as David said, my background on these topics is quite manifold from an academic perspective. Both of my dissertations were on the brain, and I'm currently finishing an evaluation of Aberdeen's autism policy. I have 2 years of support work practice as someone supporting vulnerable members of my local community in Aberdeen, where I worked with autistic people, ADHD people, etc. And many of my friends, well, including myself, are neurodivergent, even though some of you will be aware getting a diagnosis as a neurodivergent adult woman with a higher education and a job is nearly impossible. But anyway, without further ado, a few small remarks. I've been ill, so if I start coughing, I'll just mute my mic. There also is a baby in the house. I've done my best to sound isolate, but if the background noise gets too distracting, apologies. Without further ado, I think David mentioned the format of the talk. I will be occasionally screen sharing with you a couple of small slides, but for the most part, I'll just be talking at you. Cool. So to begin with, neurodiversity as activism. What is neurodiversity? Okay, screen share. Is this working? Okay. There we go. Okay, so neurodiversity is a term that was coined by the Australian autistic sociologist Judy Singer and the American journalist Harvey Bloom in 1998. Judy was working on her dissertation and Harvey was getting interested in some writing articles about the culture of Silicon Valley, and they both identified this area of interest, which well, for Judy was autism and for Harvey was the differences of how people in Silicon Valley used to approach their work culture and still do. And together they coined the term neurodiversity, referring to the natural variation of human brains. So essentially, just like we see variations in people with regards to their gender, sexuality, levels of hormonal concentrations, or physical traits, we now have reasons to believe, not just from observation, but also based on scientific research and imaging of the brain, that there is no standard setup for the human brain. There are different types of wiring in the brain, different, levels of activity across brain parts, different concentrations of certain chemicals that the brain makes. And within this diversity, that also leads to then differences in how people process the world and interact with it. Neurodivergence can be congenital or acquired, which is to say that certain forms of neurodivergence, such as being autistic or dyslexic or having ADHD, are present from birth, and others are acquired, such as, say, post-traumatic stress disorder or epilepsy, or then brain damage resulting from accident or injury. Probably the most important implication of the term neurodiversity is that it dispels the idea of normal people, because we're coming now to realize that there are so many different ways in which our brains can be structured and wired that to maintain that there is some form of norm or rule to which we can refer to as actually not realistic. Okay, I'll pause sharing. How do I do this? Stop share. There we go. Yeah. Uh, so, how is neurodiversity expressed? Well, in various ways, because once you have a difference in brain structure and functioning, that affects all of the basic brain functions, including perception, physical behaviors, and social processing, emotional processing, and attention span. We say that neurodivergence is pervasive, which means that it affects many, if not all, major areas of how someone functions. And some people might claim that they can spot somebody who is neurodivergent, that they can tell an autistic or an ADHD person. And yes, sometimes neurodivergent people have specific body language or modes of expression and self presentation. But for the most part, most of us blend in with the crowd, either by preference or because we unconsciously pick up coping and masking strategies to hide our differences. So, really, there is no way to tell a neurodivergent person from anybody else just by looking at them. Now, a quick vocab note. Neurodiversity is something that characterizes the whole of the human species, whereas individual people are not neurodiverse, but rather neurodivergent. Some people use the term neurotypical to refer to people who are not neurodivergent. I personally don't, because that implies that we're aware of all the different types of neurodivergence and that everybody who is neurodivergent is aware of that, which is not the case. So I myself abstain from using the term neurotypical. Now, though we do not have a specific physical way of observing the expressions of neurodivergence, we now have concrete scientific evidence that in fact neurodivergence is, sorry guys, this is a bit of a hiccup. I'm just gonna go to my next slide. We now have concrete scientific evidence that neurodivergence is a biological phenomenon which is firmly rooted in our bodies. So here, I really like this photo. It juxtaposes the neuron of a non-autistic person to the left with the neuron of an autistic person to the right. And as you can see, there are many more. The density of neuronal connections in the autistic brain is, just much more saturated. Hence, I say that neurodiversity is a biological phenomenon with sociopolitical implications. It's only very recent, the type of research which affords for us to observe this. Yeah, so the type of technology to assess this has only been available over the past 30 or 40 years or so. And so far, even though we have ways of mapping differences in brain function across people, all of the tests which we have to ascertain if somebody is neurodivergent, like if they're autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, dyspraxic, are still based on behavioral observation, which in itself brings a load of complexity and problems because not everybody has access to diagnosis, not everybody is aware of their neurodivergence. Why is accepting and using the term neurodiversity a form of activism? Well, firstly, I would argue because it reverses common ideas about ability, disability, and human capability in general. And to make this more clear, I'll say that neurodivergence is nestled in the social model of disability, which came about in the 1970s through the disability rights movement, and the term social model of disability explicitly as such was coined in 1983 by the disabled academic, I think Mike Oliver, if I'm not forgetting his name. So basically, classically speaking, from a medical perspective, the so-called medical or deficiency-based model of disability states that disabled people are less capable compared to non-disabled people, and that the root, well, the that the origin of their disability is their individual body, and that their individual body needs adjustment, treatment, or healing in order to be able to adapt to the requirements of society. Whereas the social model of disability states that actually disability is a two-way process between a person and their environment, which is to say that the more adjusted an environment is to a person's need, the more responsive it is to their needs, then that brings about a fluctuation in the level of disability. So for instance, if somebody is physically impaired, if they have the appropriate mobility technology to enable their movement, and if people around them know how to then make space and premises, then they wouldn't be disabled to the same extent as as when these technologies were not available. Say a big example relevant to the neurodiversity movement would be nonverbal autistic people. So some autistic people process and experience the world in a primarily nonverbal mode. And of course, me being a verbal person, I cannot describe this in much detail, but essentially not having an ongoing narrative in your mind and preferring to express through body language or other forms of communication. And these people, up to a point recently, were thought to be not intelligent, not empathetic, not capable to contribute or interact. But through assistive technologies such as keyboards or different types of software that enable the transition from written speech to vocalization. Yes, Emily, I'm seeing the comment. Absolutely, there are. I will discuss spiky cognitive profiles in a minute. And these, sorry, I got lost a bit there. So these transitions and these adaptations that we can afford people then vary the level of disability that they experience. So neurodiversity is couched in this from the perspective that if somebody is neurodivergent, yes, they are likely to have certain difficulties because our world is not mostly set up for the sensory thresholds and the modes of interaction that neurodivergent people prefer, but that if we become more inclusive, then the level of disability and difficulty that they experience can change and be improved. Um, and the second point of why neurodiversity is a form of activism is because it allows us to look at our history critically and oppose mistreatment. Neurodivergent people have suffered at the hands of institutions and society at large, even their own families. There is still research out there which pours millions and millions into research trying to cure autism through restrictive behavioral interventions, physically dangerous therapies such as chelation, which is a treatment for removing toxins such as heavy metals from the body, has a myriad of devastating side effects. Several decades ago, and sadly in some places and institutions still until today, things like electroconvulsive therapy, physical restraint, and social isolation used to be and are the norm for treating neurodivergent people. There is a shameful track record of family not in receipt of appropriate support or access to information killing their neurodivergent children. And neurodivergent people, statistically speaking, are more at risk of mental health issues, suicide, unemployment, homelessness, incarceration compared to the rest of the population. We also face social stigma. So, for instance, prior to diagnosis, ADHD people are said to be lazy, or dyslexic people are told to be stupid, or inattentive to their studies. And sometimes even what people might think are positive stereotypes, such as those of the autistic savant, are actually harmful. And finally, in terms of associating neurodiversity and activism, I have three remarks on why it's important to see it as an active mode of engagement with our systems. Notably that, okay, screen share. There we go. So it's awesome. It's super awesome because neurodiversity, using the term, adopting the term, allows us to shift the focus and power away from medical institutions, which usually were in charge of providing labels and then monopolizing power exchanges, and shifting them away to neurodivergent activists themselves, their communities, their allies, researchers who are doing emancipatory research. Also, neurodiversity opens up a conversation about social responsibility and empowers us to make changes within our institutions where we can claim better acceptance, better understanding, better adjustments to the need of neurodivergent people. And finally, it celebrates diversity and the strengths of neurodivergent people, you know. So this is something very important as well, which the neurodivergence model has, that the medical model of viewing neurodivergence does is a celebration of the strengths of neurodivergent people, which are not included in the diagnostic profiles for the conditions. So, for instance, autistic people are known to have what are called special interests, which are areas of tremendous focus and fascination, in which they can often become experts even without formal schooling. Or people who have ADHD are known to have nonlinear ways of approaching problems, and business research now shows that they can come up with innovative entrepreneurial models. Or say some dyslexic people, not, although not so attuned to written text, maybe excellent storytellers and actors who have found alternative ways of reading social situations and analyzing information. This is something I meant to say earlier. As a lot of my research focuses on autism, it might be the case that many of my examples lean towards autism. I do not mean to overrepresent it or insist that it is more common or important than other forms of neurodivergence. I just happen to be most familiar with it. So if you'd like to add any specifics in the Q&A, or discuss other forms of neurodivergence, please do. Now I'll discuss a few important terms that are associated with neurodiversity. And though I believe the jargon should be limited to a minimum, I think they're important to complete our understanding. So firstly, neurological variants and their spectrum. No two people, even if they both share a diagnosis, are alike. And there are so many differences in presentation, be they because of people's gender or their skill sets, or maybe the presence or the presence of intellectual disability. So you cannot make assumptions about the entirety of a condition or type of neurodivergence just based on one person. You say, if you've met one autistic person, then, well, you've met one autistic person. Neurological variants are different types of neurological setups. So for instance, autism is a neurological variant, ADHD is a neurological variant. And then that brings me to the second set of terms, which are comorbidity and intersectionality. So comorbidity is a term used to describe the medical overlap between various conditions and sensitivities. And in that way, people can be doubly neurodivergent. So you can be autistic and ADHD, or be dyspraxic and dyslexic at the same time. But also, oftentimes neurodivergent people will also have other medical conditions. They might have learning disabilities, or for instance, physical disabilities, or various sensitivities such as eye conditions or arthritis, insomnia, celiac disease. And the overall health profile of how somebody's neurodivergence also ties into other things might be quite complicated. And then intersectionality, a term which most of us are familiar with, also very much affects how somebody's neurodiversity is expressed. And we usually think about intersectionality in terms of class, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, but I've made a little slide when I was trying to think about other facets of intersectionality, which might be important when we think about a person's identity. So in addition to age, gender, sexuality, race, and ethnicity, I also include religion, political convictions, socioeconomic background, physical conditions that would include things like, say, menstruating, or being pregnant, or being tired, disease, physical disability, a mental health condition, neurological difference such as neurodivergence, dependence, whether somebody is looking after other people, past trauma, skills and experience, and personal circumstances, whether, say, you've just taken on a new job, if you lost your home. So all of these things will affect our experience from moment to moment. And when we're in a social situation, we have no way of knowing what exactly somebody is going through. So I think they're important to consider, and especially in with relation to neurodivergent people, because oftentimes they have non-traditional lifestyles, be it because they're also members of the LGBTQI plus community, or they have a non-traditional occupation or work model. Um, Also, misdiagnosis and underdiagnosis are two important terms. Misdiagnosis meaning an incorrect diagnosis. It is often the case that neurodivergent people might first receive, especially if they're adults, a diagnosis for a mental health condition such as anxiety or depression, but these are often associated and not the primary cause of somebody's discomfort or difficulties with adaptation. And then underdiagnosis is lack to diagnostic facilities, which very often is the case for neurodivergent adults who made it past schooling and in some way have found employment. So up until this very day, say autistic women are underdiagnosed, and the classic literature would suggest that it's primarily a boy's condition, whereas we're gradually starting to find out that that's not the case, but women just manifest differently. Um, and then a little bit of a note about functioning levels and levels of support needs. So sometimes terms are thrown around. People speak about people being uh, uh, severely autistic or people with low or high support needs, but that language I think is outdated and doesn't really capture the complexities. Firstly, because we all have support needs. To say that somebody's support needs or needs are special does not seem to be adequate, but also because our levels of support vary, and where sometimes we will have coping strategies in place, or we'll be able to navigate a situation through our skills and prior planning, sometimes these will not be available. So there will be fluctuations in somebody's level of support needs. And I find it best to just speak about concrete support needs. What does a person need in a specific environment and situation? Then spiky cognitive profiles, which I think to some extent ties into the comment that um, Emily made. Spiky cognitive profiles refer to the fact that we should not assume a level of intelligence or skill based on a partial observation of a person's character. So, say, um, I have a friend, she knows 4 languages, is a PhD student, but can't tell left from right. She's probably dyspraxic or ADHD. She's seeking diagnosis. And no amount of practice will help her kind of build up those connections in her brain that allow her to navigate space better or in a way as other people do. So spiky cognitive profiles refer to the fact that we all have strengths and weaknesses, and that when it comes to neurodivergent people, sometimes these might be, how to say, in high contrast. So as Emily was saying, sometimes people who are verbal throughout some of their day might go nonverbal as levels of stress or exhaustion peak later on, or say sometimes neurodivergent people might not be able to cope with certain logistical tasks or organizing their homes or keeping up with their social networks. And that is something that will fluctuate depending on the current situation that they're experiencing in their life or the access that they have to support networks and their own coping strategies. Um, and then finally, 2 terms. One is sensory diet. A sensory diet is getting to know how you react to different stimuli and what makes you feel over and understimulated. This is super important for neurodivergent people because oftentimes, because their brains are different, how information comes and is filtered through might be very different. So they might be very susceptible to like levels of light or noise or electrical pulsation in a room in a way in which other people might not be. And a sensory diet basically is making a plan for yourself as an individual, or maybe even sometimes on the basis of a community event, how to keep on top of stimulation so that you are able to focus and communicate and don't feel exhausted and overloaded. And anyone can benefit from having a sensory diet, even if they're not neurodivergent. You know, it generally helps you focus, keep on top of your sleep, you know, feel more Relax throughout your day. And the final term I really like in relation to neurodivergence is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability over time to change its wiring and redirect some of its pathways so that some of our association with certain stimuli or behaviors might change. So, say something that used to be a trigger for intense anxiety might over time become something to which we are neutral. Now, neuroplasticity is not it does not imply that neurodivergent people can grow out of their conditions or cure them, but it has to do with the fact that over time, with the appropriate amount of effort, attention, sustained effort, we can change ways in which we react to things, but that is a gradual process. Um, okay, now neurodiversity in activism. Um, Awareness of neurodiversity is not enough. Recent research shows that over 90% of Scotland are aware of autism, but stigma and misconceptions about autistic people perceive. So really we aim for understanding and applying our understanding through reconfiguring our practices and spaces to a point of integration and mainstreaming of neurodiversity. Such behavior should be the norm. It's not to be seen as some exceptional effort. And it's important to remember that making a group more inclusive and an environment more accessible is not only to the benefit of select individuals, but it benefits the group. And several important arguments towards that point are firstly that neurodivergence and disability are not rare phenomena. According to current estimates from the Department of Work and Pensions, around 15% of the UK population is neurodivergent, and also according to statistical research, there are now 13 million disabled people in the UK, roughly a fifth of the population, and that includes 18% of the adult population. And remember, that's not even including the people who are underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed. Um, so really, um, secondly, making an environment more inclusive for some people often makes it accessible for a much larger group than the target audience. Okay, this is a very basic example, but for instance, a wheelchair ramp can also afford access to a person with a cast on their leg, a mother with a pram, or someone traveling with a suitcase. And especially with regards to neurodivergence, the high sensitivity that neurodivergent people often have to their surroundings generally mean that they seek cozy, interactive, welcoming environments. And these are good for anyone, you know, be it for newcomers to our activist settings, for people who are like suffering from stress after a long day of work. Trying to fine tune our environments to the needs of more sensitive people creates calmer and more open spaces for us all. And finally, a strategic benefit of incorporating diverse people in our planning and in our organizations is that organizational research now shows that the more diverse a planning and implementation group is when it comes to events or various activities, the better decisions are made. More diverse groups ask more questions, they refer to facts more frequently than more homogeneous group, and they also reach decisions quicker and are more creative. And this brings me to the final bit of our presentation about practical recommendations, how to make our activist spaces more inclusive. And I've structured it in three main areas. Um, so attitudes, participation, and practice, three things to think about from the very get-go, from the onset of planning an event or an activity to its very execution. So in terms of attitudes, I'd say flexibility, inquisitiveness, humility are the key attitudes. To be more inclusive, we can't always predict the exact needs of everyone who take part in our activities. We have to be prepared to change aspects of the environment as we go along. It's actually necessary to have clear points of contact prior to your events so potential participants can ask questions and make their needs known. And it's important to make it clear that you're open to suggestions. Many neurodivergent people are used to masking their reactions or denying their needs, which leads to unnecessary stress or sometimes even just a refusal to participate in events, not knowing how they'll be able to cope with the environmental stressors. Feeling invited to state your needs and communicational preferences makes a world of difference. Then ask people how their needs are best met, and do your research if you come across sensitivities you knew little about previously. And you don't have to do that as a solitary effort. You can contact other activist groups, charities, or research organizations for resources and training, and that could lead to excellent collaborations. As a rule of thumb, only reach out to organizations which have representatives of their focus group on the committee, or even better, are explicitly founded and chaired by such people. I know of 2 APOs, Autistic Persons Organizations in Scotland. There's also a number of DPOs, Disabled Persons Organizations, and there are also a large variety of charities or informal groups that you could consult for more information. There are many charities out there that actually don't have, say it's an autistic charity, but they don't have any autistic people on in an executive position. And I would generally regard these with some suspicion, because misconceptions and the mistakes made even from a place of good intentions can sneak in if they're not held in alignment by people whose interests are directly involved in the work of said organization. Then, in the context of participation, as previously discussed, the more diverse your decision-making and planning team is, sorry, I got carried away reading a comment. Yeah, the better. Ensure that campaigns or events which address the experiences of a particular group of people are always headed or co-hosted by representatives of that group. And if you're trying to make an event accessible for people with specific sensory profiles or physical impairments, get them on board from the get-go. It's always easier to plan an event with a specific need in mind than to retrospectively try to adjust your planning to cater to it. But also, these people might have suggestions about appropriate venues or platforms, and will be in a position to give you specific practical guidance how to meet their needs and preferences best. There is also a flip side of inclusion, and that is tokenism. And I say, don't go to the same one person for advice on all your consecutive events. So say if you have an ADHD woman on your planning committee, don't tokenize her as a spokesperson on all things ADHD. Ask her if she knows other ADHD people, or if she can get you in touch with an organization or activist group for more input, because a single person cannot stand for an entire community. It's too demanding of them and doesn't do justice to that diversity of the group. Plus, I think for activist circles, it's really nice to establish relations in between different groups. And even if you're not, say, doing explicitly social activism, maybe you're doing environmental work, to be able to discuss the intersectionality of your goals and how to make your practice more inclusive is still really beneficial to both sides. Now, finally, practical advice. I'd say begin by thinking about the ways in which you can diversify modes of engagement with your activism, something we've definitely all had to do during this pandemic. There you go. Are you making enough use of virtual or remote forms of participation? Because people who can't make it to your events or dislike the sensory environment of live events such as protests or large gatherings, not that we're having many of those right now, they might still like to contribute to your work. So things like managing social media platforms, graphic design, creating online content, research, fundraising, establishing contact with other organizations, all of these are very significant activities which can be performed remotely. Then work towards normalizing information dissemination practices about and throughout your events. Make everything as clear as possible. You know, if you have a venue, then have detailed venue descriptions, maybe even snapshots, of interior spaces, a map of the location and instructions how to get there. Likewise, with online events, provide as much details about the used platform and the etiquette of interaction in advance. Schedules of events, including break times and informations on internal facilities, such as toilets or kitchen facilities, hearing loops, types of seating, ramps, railings. provide trigger warnings for sudden sensory stimuli, such as loud noises and bright flashing lights, as well as for trauma, violence, or abuse-related content. Many neurodivergent people can get overwhelmed by sensation due to acute sensitivity, or just they need some dedicated time to process and synthesize between activities and interactions. If that is um, an option in a physical space, then designate a space for decompression and processing, like a quiet room of sorts, or if you know that there's a nearby garden or a park for the lunch break, make that known to people. And then for virtual events, if you're running a longer event, try to have some breaks in between panels and sometimes even between talks and their Q&As if they're longer. And as I said before, make it known that you're willing to make adjustments to the sensory environment. And in case the venue itself does not have things like dimmable lights or readily accessible heating control, you can do a lot of what's called like reasonable adjustments without breaking the bank. You know, you can have small portable lamps or blankets or cushions, single use earplugs, ear defenders. All of these things can allow people to modulate their sensory environment. And you often find that people who are aware of the needs of their sensory diet will have these to hand, but just need some to feel welcome for using the adaptations that make them feel comfortable. And in case of bigger events, as is the case with this one, wherever possible, provide video recordings and captions or transcripts because people do process information differently. So say somebody dyslexic might want to then run a transcript for a dyslexic font so they can make it more accessible to themselves. And if you have the time, invite and collate anonymous and in-person feedback of the accessibility and inclusivity of your events to get an idea what worked well and what could be improved in future instances. And really, this concludes my talk.